John Eisenhower came across the manuscript pages in April 1969, a little over a month after his father passed away at Walter Reed Army Medical Center. The pages were yellowing at the edges. Working through Dwight D. Eisenhower's personal papers at the family home in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, John found what appeared to be draft chapters for a book that had never made it to publication. The handwriting was unmistakably his father's, though noticeably shakier than in earlier years, a detail that suggested the pages had been written during the former president's final illness. At the top of the first page was a title, Reflections on Coalition Command, What I Wish I Had Said. John had known his father was working on some kind of memoir project during retirement, but this material was unfamiliar. As he began reading, he understood why it might have been held back rather than published while Eisenhower was alive. The manuscript opened with a preamble explaining its purpose directly. Throughout my time as Supreme Allied Commander and later as President, I was constrained by diplomatic necessity and political consideration in what I could say publicly about the various Allied forces under my command. Now, in my final months, with no more political ambitions and no diplomatic fences to mend, I wish to set down my honest assessment of those who fought under my command, unconstrained by the requirements of coalition management. John recognized this as entirely consistent with his father's methodical approach to leadership and history. Eisenhower had always been careful about what he has said publicly regarding Allied contributions, understanding that maintaining coalition unity required diplomatic language and a deliberate distribution of credit. But he had apparently wanted to leave a more candid record, even if not one intended for immediate publication. The first substantial section dealt with Canadian forces, and it was this section that made John understand why his father might have hesitated to release the manuscript during his lifetime. The assessment was frank to the point of being controversial, acknowledging things about Allied military cooperation that official histories had carefully papered over. The Canadians Eisenhower had written were consistently undervalued in my official statements and in the historical narratives that emerged during and after the war. This undervaluation was partly unintentional, a natural consequence of American focus on American contributions, but partly deliberate, a result of political pressures that made it difficult to fully acknowledge how much the Allied effort depended on forces from smaller nations. John knew his father had expressed genuine respect for Canadian military contributions in various official settings throughout his career. But this manuscript went further, admitting directly that his public statements had never fully reflected his private assessment of Canadian capabilities and what Canada had actually contributed. When I assumed command of Allied forces preparing for the invasion of Europe, the manuscript continued. I inherited a military situation where Canadian forces were already deeply integrated into British operational structures. Canadian divisions had been training in Britain since 1939, had combat experience from Sicily and Italy, and had developed institutional expertise in several crucial areas, including amphibious operations, mine warfare, and winter combat. My initial understanding of Canadian capabilities was limited. American military planning had focused primarily on our own force development and on coordination with Britain as the senior Allied partner in Europe. Canada was often treated as an extension of British military power, rather than as an independent force with its own operational characteristics and command structure. This admission of initial ignorance was characteristic of Eisenhower's willingness to acknowledge his own learning process. I came to understand through direct observation during the planning and execution of Operation Overlord that Canadian forces were not simply British units with different accents. They had distinctive operational approaches, particularly aggressive tactical doctrine, and commanders who thought independently about how to accomplish assigned missions. The manuscript then moved through specific operations where Canadian performance had shaped Eisenhower's thinking. The assault on Juno Beach on D-Day, where Canadian forces had pushed further inland than any other Allied formation on the first day. The fighting around Caen, where Canadians had tied down German armored divisions that might otherwise have struck against the American breakout. The closing of the Falaise Gap, accomplished primarily by Canadian forces against desperate German resistance. Each of these operations was more difficult than public accounts suggested, and each required capabilities that I had not initially fully appreciated Canadian forces possessed. The penetration at Juno Beach required not just courage, but tactical sophistication in getting off the beach and through prepared German defenses. The fighting around Caen required willingness to sustain casualties while maintaining offensive pressure. The Falaise operation required operational persistence against elite German forces trying desperately to escape encirclement. John found himself drawn deeper into his father's analysis. This was military history being composed by the man who had directed these operations, who had made the strategic decisions that shaped how they unfolded, and who was now, in his final months, offering a judgment free of the constraints that had governed every public statement he had ever made. The manuscript addressed the political dimensions of coalition command without flinching. As Supreme Commander, I had to manage not just military operations, but Allied relationships that were often fraught with national sensitivities and competing political objectives. The British, as the senior Allied partner in Europe before American forces arrived in large numbers, expected certain deference and were sensitive about any suggestion that American forces were more important than British forces. This created difficulties in acknowledging Canadian contributions because the Canadians were operationally subordinate to British command structures in most cases, but were also increasingly assertive about their own national identity and their desire for recognition, independent of British achievements. To fully acknowledge Canadian contributions sometimes meant implicitly criticizing British command decisions or raising questions about British operational effectiveness in ways that could damage the coalition. This was frank diplomacy, an acknowledgement that coalition politics had at times prevented full recognition of Canadian accomplishments because that recognition would have introduced complications nobody wanted to manage. The result was that I often spoke in generalities about Allied successes when Canadian forces had been primarily responsible, or I would credit combined British-Canadian operations when Canadian forces had done the crucial work. This served coalition unity, but created historical distortions that I now wish to correct. The manuscript then provided specific examples of this diplomatic editing. After the liberation of the Netherlands, Eisenhower had issued statements praising Allied forces without specifically noting that the liberation was almost entirely a Canadian operation. After the Scheldt campaign that opened Antwerp for Allied use, He had praised the 21st Army Group without emphasizing that Canadian forces had conducted the grinding combat that actually cleared the estuary. I justified these omissions at the time as necessary for coalition management. Montgomery was sensitive about any suggestion that Canadian forces under his operational command were more effective than British forces. Canadian commanders were sensitive about being subsumed into British identity. American political leaders wanted American contributions emphasized for domestic consumption. Balancing these competing demands meant that precision about who actually accomplished what often gave way to diplomatic generality. John understood why his father might have set this aside rather than publish it. It acknowledged systematic bias in how coalition contributions had been recognized and suggested that the historical record needed significant correction. Publishing it could have reopened wartime wounds and complicated diplomatic relationships his father valued. But it also showed Eisenhower's commitment to historical accuracy, his determination to document what he believed had actually happened, unconstrained, finally, by the political considerations that had shaped everything he had said in public. The section on Canadian forces continued with detailed operational analysis. Eisenhower compared Canadian military performance to American and British forces operating in adjacent sectors, noting specific differences in tactical approach and operational outcome. Canadian operational tempo was consistently higher than British forces in similar situations. Where British forces would often pause to consolidate gains and prepare methodically for the next phase, Canadian forces maintained pressure more continuously. This aggressive approach sometimes led to heavy Canadian casualties, but it also prevented German forces from reorganizing effective defenses. American forces showed similar aggressiveness, but with less tactical sophistication in the early phases of the campaign. Canadian forces combined aggressive operational tempo with careful tactical planning in ways that made their operations particularly effective. By the time American forces developed similar sophistication through combat experience, the Canadians had already established themselves as one of the most capable forces in theater. This comparative assessment carried weight precisely because it came from someone who had commanded all of these forces and could evaluate them from direct professional observation. The manuscript assessed specific Canadian commanders and what they had contributed. General James Carleton, commanding the 1st Canadian Army, was described as competent in overall command, but sometimes overshadowed by more aggressive subordinate commanders. Lieutenant General Robert Aldrich, commanding the 2nd Canadian Corps, was described as one of the finest tactical minds among all Allied commanders, innovative and aggressive in equal measure. Aldrich developed tactics for breakthrough operations that American forces later adopted. His use of modified self-propelled artillery as armored personnel carriers for infantry showed the kind of field innovation that I valued highly, but that didn't always receive the recognition it deserved. Had Aldrich been American or British, his tactical innovations would have been more widely celebrated and adopted. This observation touched on something John knew had concerned his father: the tendency for innovations from smaller Allied nations to be overlooked or later credited to British or American forces that had learned from them. The manuscript also addressed Canadian logistics and industrial support, areas Eisenhower understood were central to military effectiveness, but that received considerably less attention in popular histories focused on combat operations. Canadian war production was remarkable for a nation of 12 million people. They supplied not just their own forces, but provided substantial support to British forces and to other Allied nations. Canadian factories produced vehicles, aircraft, ships, and ammunition in quantities that rivaled much larger nations. This industrial contribution was as important as their combat contributions, but received even less recognition. He noted that Canadian logistics were consistently reliable throughout the campaign, that Canadian forces were consistently well supplied, well maintained, and operationally ready. In coalition warfare, where supply coordination across multiple national forces was a constant challenge, Canadian logistical self-sufficiency had real operational value. The manuscript then moved from specific military assessment to broader reflections on coalition warfare and how Allied contributions should be remembered. In my role as Supreme Commander, I learned that effective coalition operations require constant attention to ensuring that all partners feel their contributions are recognized and valued. When recognition is unbalanced, or when smaller partners feel their contributions are being subsumed into larger partners' achievements, it creates resentment that can undermine operational cooperation. With the Canadians, I faced a situation where their contributions were objectively significant, but where political and structural factors made full recognition complicated. They were fighting as part of British commanded formations in most cases, which made it natural for British command to receive credit. They were smaller in total force size than American contributions, which made it easy for American narratives to focus on American forces. They were modest in promoting their own achievements, which meant they sometimes got overlooked in favor of forces that were more aggressive about publicizing their accomplishments. Eisenhower admitted he had not fully resolved this problem during his time as Supreme Commander. I tried to ensure Canadian forces received appropriate recognition, but I now acknowledge that my efforts were insufficient. Political pressures, coalition management requirements, and my own initial lack of understanding about Canadian capabilities all contributed to systematic undervaluation of Canadian contributions in official narratives. The manuscript grew more reflective as it progressed, with Eisenhower considering what coalition warfare had taught him about leadership, national power, and how military history gets written. One of the most important lessons I learned from commanding Allied forces was that military effectiveness does not scale linearly with national size or resources. Canada, with a fraction of America's population and industrial capacity, fielded forces that often outperformed American forces in specific operations. This was not because Canadians were inherently better soldiers than Americans, but because Canadian military development emphasized different priorities and because Canadian forces had combat experience that American forces initially lacked. This meant that assumptions about military contribution based on national size were often wrong. I made these assumptions myself initially and had to learn through direct observation that smaller nations could punch well above their weight through effective training, good leadership, and strong national commitment to the war effort. John found this admission striking. His father was acknowledging that he had started with the same biases about national power and military capability that most Americans carried, and that experience had forced him to revise them. The intellectual honesty was characteristic of the man, but seeing it documented so explicitly was something else entirely. The manuscript section on the Scheldt operation was particularly detailed, and Eisenhower's language left no room for diplomatic softening. The Scheldt operation was one of the most difficult of the entire Northwest Europe campaign. The terrain was nightmarish. Flooded polders, fortified islands, prepared German defenses in positions that had been developed over years. The strategic importance was immense because without opening Antwerp, our logistics for the final push into Germany would be severely constrained. Canadian forces conducted this operation with minimal support from other Allied forces. They developed specialized tactics for amphibious assault in flooded terrain. They maintained offensive pressure despite heavy casualties. And they accomplished every objective despite facing determined German defense. The operation took longer and caused more casualties than initial planning had anticipated, but it succeeded completely. I am convinced that few other forces could have accomplished this mission under these conditions. It required technical expertise in specialized operations, willingness to sustain operations despite setbacks, and operational persistence over weeks of grinding combat. The Canadians demonstrated all these qualities, and the result was strategic success that enabled the final Allied advances in 1945. He devoted equal attention to the liberation of the Netherlands, an operation Eisenhower knew held particular meaning for both Canadians and Dutch people, but that had received limited coverage in American accounts of the war. The liberation of the Netherlands was accomplished almost entirely by Canadian forces over a period from September 1944 to May 1945. This was not a single dramatic operation, but a sustained campaign involving multiple battles, extensive mine-clearing operations, and eventually the provision of food and medical aid to a Dutch population that was near starvation. The Canadian role in liberating the Netherlands created a bond between Canada and the Netherlands that persisted for decades after the war. When I visited the Netherlands as president, Dutch citizens would frequently express their gratitude for Canadian liberation. It was clear that Canadians had not just freed the Dutch from occupation, but had done so in ways that earned lasting respect and affection. This relationship between Canadians and the Dutch is part of World War II history that Americans often don't know about, because it didn't involve American forces. But it is important for understanding the full scope of Allied operations, and for recognizing that military success includes not just defeating enemy forces, but liberating occupied populations in ways that build lasting positive relationships. Eisenhower then turned to more difficult territory, specific instances where Canadian contributions had been minimized or misrepresented in official accounts, and his own role in those misrepresentations. There were times when I was asked by American media about specific operations, and in my responses, I emphasized American contributions while giving less attention to Canadian contributions. This was partly because American journalists and audiences were naturally interested in American forces, but it was also because I sometimes chose to avoid complications that might arise from emphasizing that Canadian forces had accomplished objectives that American forces had not. He provided a specific example. When journalists asked about the D-Day landings, I would typically focus on Omaha Beach, where American forces faced the most difficult conditions and suffered the heaviest casualties. This created an impression that D-Day was primarily an American operation, when in fact, British and Canadian forces had landed on 3 of the 5 beaches and accomplished significant objectives. The Canadian penetration inland from Juno Beach was the deepest of any force on D-Day, but this fact received minimal attention in American media coverage. I could have corrected this misimpression by providing more balanced accounts of all 5 beaches, and by specifically noting Canadian accomplishments at Juno, but doing so might have diminished the dramatic narrative about American sacrifice at Omaha that was resonating with American audiences, and that was important for maintaining public support for the war effort. I chose narrative simplicity over historical accuracy, and I regret that choice now. This was a significant admission that Eisenhower had knowingly allowed inaccurate impressions to persist because correcting them would have been narratively or politically inconvenient. It revealed the extent to which coalition politics and public relations considerations had shaped how the war was presented to contemporary audiences and subsequently preserved in the historical record. The manuscript discussed his relationships with senior Canadian commanders in terms more candid than anything he had said publicly during his lifetime. Carleton was more flexible in working within coalition command structures, but he was also firm about Canadian interests and about ensuring Canadian forces received appropriate recognition. He would raise concerns about Canadian contributions being minimized in official communications, and he was often right about those concerns. I tried to address them, but was constrained by broader coalition management requirements that made it difficult to be as specific about Canadian accomplishments as Carleton wanted. Aldridge was the most impressive of the Canadian commanders I worked with. He thought innovatively about tactical problems and was willing to try new approaches when conventional methods weren't working. If he had been commanding American forces, he would have been promoted to Army Command based on his performance. That he commanded only a corps reflected Canadian force size limitations, rather than any deficiency in his capabilities. Eisenhower acknowledged that coalition command required a constant balancing of national sensitivities. Every Allied nation wanted recognition commensurate with its contributions. But there was never enough credit, publicity, or official acknowledgement to fully satisfy everyone. I tried to be fair in how I distributed recognition, but looking back, I can see that Canadian forces received less recognition relative to their contributions than American or British forces did. The manuscript grew more personal in its later sections, with Eisenhower reflecting on what commanding Allied forces had taught him about leadership, human nature, and his own capabilities and limitations. Commanding coalition forces during the most important military operation of the 20th century was the defining experience of my life. It taught me things about leadership and about warfare that I could not have learned any other way. Among the most important lessons was learning to recognize capability and effectiveness regardless of preconceptions about national power or military tradition. The Canadians taught me this lesson perhaps more clearly than any other Allied force. I began the war assuming that military effectiveness would correlate with national size and industrial capacity. The Americans would be most effective because we were the largest and most powerful. The British would be next because of their long military tradition. Smaller Allied nations would be appreciated for their contributions, but would not be primary actors in major operations. Direct experience showed me this assumption was wrong. Canadians were primary actors in major operations. They accomplished objectives that required elite-level military capability. They performed consistently at high standards across multiple campaigns and different types of operations. National size was not the determining factor in military effectiveness. Training, leadership, commitment, and experience were what mattered. The manuscript acknowledged that revising these assumptions had not come easily. Changing deeply held assumptions about national power and military capability required confronting my own prejudices and preconceptions. It meant acknowledging that I had underestimated Canadian forces initially and that my strategic planning had not adequately accounted for their capabilities. This kind of intellectual honesty doesn't come easily, especially for someone in command who is supposed to have all the answers. But coalition command requires this kind of learning and adaptation. You cannot command effectively if you cannot recognize when your assumptions are wrong and adjust accordingly. The Canadians, through their performance in combat, forced me to adjust my assumptions and to develop a more accurate understanding of what different Allied forces could contribute. The manuscript concluded with Eisenhower's thoughts on how history should remember the Allied victory in Europe and what place Canadian forces should hold in that memory. World War II in Europe was won by a coalition of nations that each contributed different capabilities and resources toward a common goal. The United States provided enormous industrial capacity and eventually deployed the largest number of combat forces. Britain provided operational bases, naval power, and extensive experience from years of fighting before America entered the war. The Soviet Union bore the brunt of German military power and suffered casualties that dwarfed Western Allied losses. And nations like Canada, while smaller in total contribution, provided specialized capabilities and operated at levels of effectiveness that made them crucial to success. History should remember all these contributions proportionally and accurately. That has not happened with Canadian contributions, which have been systematically undervalued in American and even in some British historical accounts. As someone who commanded these forces and who bears some responsibility for how their contributions were recognized during and immediately after the war, I want to state clearly, for the historical record, Canadian forces were among the most effective Allied forces in the European theater. Their contributions were crucial to Allied victory, and they deserve recognition commensurate with their accomplishments. If historians use this manuscript as source material, I hope they will examine Canadian operations carefully and will correct the systematic undervaluation that has characterized too much World War II historiography. The Canadians earned better than they received in terms of historical recognition. Setting that record straight is part of ensuring we understand accurately how the war was actually fought and won. The manuscript ended with a personal note revealing Eisenhower's full awareness of what he was doing and how much time remained. I write this in full knowledge that I am in my final months. The heart condition that has plagued me for years is worsening, and I know my time is limited. I want to use what remains to set down truths that I was constrained from speaking during my active career. About the Canadians, the truth is simple. They were better than we acknowledged, more important than we admitted, more effective than we recognized. They deserved better from me as their supreme commander, and they deserve better from history. I hope these words help provide the recognition they earned but did not receive. John Eisenhower sat back from reading, deeply moved by what his father had written. This was confession, tribute, and historical correction at once, a document that revealed dimensions of his father's thinking about coalition command that no public statement had ever captured. But John also understood immediately why it was complicated. It explicitly acknowledged systematic bias in how Allied contributions had been recognized. It admitted that Eisenhower himself had contributed to that bias through conscious decisions about how to allocate credit and shape narratives. It suggested that the historical record of World War II needed significant revision regarding Canadian contributions. Publishing it could reopen wartime wounds, challenge established narratives that many American and British historians had invested in, and create diplomatic friction despite being written with evident good faith. John spent weeks considering what to do with the manuscript. He consulted military historians, former colleagues of his father, and Canadian officials. The consensus was that the material was historically important, but that releasing it immediately would be controversial in ways that might overshadow other dimensions of his father's legacy. The decision was made to deposit the manuscript in the Eisenhower Presidential Library under restricted access. It would be available to serious researchers, but not published for general audiences right away. This compromise honored Eisenhower's desire to set down his honest assessment while managing the potential complications of that assessment becoming widely known within weeks of his death. Over subsequent decades, portions of the manuscript were cited by researchers who accessed it through the archives. Its existence became known to Canadian military historians, some of whom referenced it in books and articles about Canadian contributions to Allied victory. Eisenhower's acknowledgement of systematic undervaluation was particularly valued as direct confirmation from the Allied Supreme Commander himself of what Canadian historians had been arguing for years. The complete manuscript was not published until 2004, 35 years after Eisenhower's death. By then, most of the people who might have been directly affected by its contents were gone. The historical controversies it addressed had receded enough that the manuscript could be read primarily as a historical document rather than a contemporary political statement. Published with extensive annotation by military historians, it generated substantial scholarly interest. Eisenhower's admission that Canadian contributions had been deliberately minimized for coalition management purposes provided authoritative confirmation of what Canadian historians had been building a case for across decades. His specific assessments of Canadian operational capabilities, coming from a man who had commanded those forces professionally and at the highest level, carried a different kind of weight than anything that could be produced from within Canada. The manuscript also sparked broader discussions about how coalition warfare history gets written. Eisenhower's candid admission that diplomatic and political considerations had shaped his public statements about Allied contributions raised questions about how much military history had been similarly shaped by factors beyond honest assessment of military performance. Professor Margaret Atkinson at Oxford University published a comprehensive study in 2007 examining what Eisenhower's manuscript revealed about broader patterns in coalition history writing. Eisenhower's admission that Canadian contributions were deliberately minimized for coalition management purposes suggests we need to examine all coalition operations with skepticism about whether official accounts reflect actual contributions or diplomatic convenience. She wrote, her research identified similar patterns with other Allied forces. Free French contributions were often described vaguely as part of Allied operations without specific recognition of French accomplishments. Polish forces, who fought under British command in Italy and elsewhere, received minimal recognition in English-language histories. Belgian, Dutch, Norwegian, and other forces that fought alongside the major powers were frequently rendered almost invisible in accounts that focused on British and American operations. Eisenhower's manuscript gives us explicit admission from the Allied Supreme Commander that these patterns were deliberate. This means we cannot trust official accounts at face value. We need to examine operational records, casualty lists, unit assignments, and contemporary documents to understand who actually accomplished specific objectives rather than relying on official statements that were shaped by political considerations. This methodological critique influenced a generation of World War II scholarship that took a more critical approach to examining whose contributions were recognized and whose were quietly minimized in official histories. The manuscript also prompted new research into Eisenhower's own evolution as a coalition commander. His admission that he had begun with biased assumptions about Canadian capabilities and had been corrected by experience sparked interest in tracing how his views changed during the war and how that evolution influenced his command decisions. Dr. Robert Harrison at the U.S. Army War College published a detailed study in 2009 drawing on newly accessed documents from both American and Canadian archives. Harrison traced how Eisenhower's assessment of Canadian capabilities developed from the planning stages of Operation Overlord through the end of the war. Eisenhower's initial operational planning treated Canadian forces as essentially British units with different national identity but similar capabilities, Harrison found. His planning documents from early 1944 show little differentiation between British and Canadian forces in terms of expected performance or optimal employment. But by mid-1944, after direct observation of Canadian operations during and after D-Day, Eisenhower's private communications show clear recognition that Canadian forces had distinctive operational characteristics. He began requesting that Canadian forces be assigned to particularly difficult objectives because he had observed their ability to sustain operations despite heavy casualties. Harrison documented specific instances where Eisenhower's developing recognition of Canadian capabilities directly influenced operational planning. The assignment of Canadian forces to close the Falaise Gap was partly because Eisenhower believed they would maintain offensive pressure against the determined German resistance expected there. The assignment of the entire Netherlands liberation to Canadian forces reflected confidence that they could manage a complex operation involving both combat and civil affairs without extensive support from other Allied formations. What the manuscript reveals, Harrison concluded, is that Eisenhower's private operational assessment of Canadian capabilities was significantly more positive than his public statement suggested. He knew what they could do. He planned operations around their capabilities. But he didn't translate that operational trust into proportional public recognition. Understanding this gap between private assessment and public acknowledgement is crucial for understanding both Eisenhower's leadership style and how coalition history gets written. For Canadian audiences, the manuscript's publication was received as something close to vindication. Eisenhower, the supreme Allied commander, had acknowledged in writing that Canadian forces had been more effective than public accounts reflected, and that this effectiveness deserved recognition commensurate with what it had actually produced. Coming from someone of his stature and authority, the acknowledgement carried a weight that no amount of Canadian historical research conducted from within Canada could have replicated. Canadian newspapers ran prominent coverage. Television documentaries examined what the manuscript revealed about Canada's wartime contributions. Veterans organizations held events marking what they characterized as long overdue confirmation of what Canadian soldiers had accomplished. Prime Minister Paul Martin issued a statement acknowledging the significance of Eisenhower's words. General Eisenhower's words, written in his final months, provide authoritative confirmation of what Canadians have always known about our military contributions to Allied victory. That he felt compelled to set down this assessment in writing shows the depth of his respect for Canadian forces and his concern that history should remember their contributions accurately. American reaction was more varied. Some commentators praised Eisenhower's intellectual honesty in acknowledging how coalition politics had bent historical narratives. Others argued the manuscript's emphasis on Canadian contributions was overstated, or that it represented late-life reflection rather than Eisenhower's operational assessment in real time. Military historians generally treated the manuscript as an important contribution to understanding coalition warfare and how military history gets shaped. Valuable not only for what it said about Canadian forces, but for what it revealed about the political factors that governed how all Allied contributions were recognized and remembered. The manuscript became required reading in NATO staff colleges as an illustration of how effective coalition command requires recognizing and genuinely valuing contributions from all partners. Eisenhower's admission that he had not done enough to ensure Canadian contributions received proportional recognition was used as a teaching example, a cautionary account of how coalition leaders can fail their partners even while believing themselves to be managing the alliance responsibly. For John Eisenhower, the decision to release his father's manuscript after a long delay had been difficult, but ultimately felt right. My father believed in historical honesty, John wrote in the introduction to the published manuscript. He understood during his career that diplomatic and political considerations sometimes required less than complete candor in public statements. But he also believed that ultimately history should reflect truth rather than diplomatic convenience. This manuscript represents his attempt to set down truth as he understood it, free from the constraints that had shaped his public statements. The Canadian sections of this manuscript reveal my father's deep respect for Canadian military capabilities, and his regret that this respect had not been expressed more fully during his lifetime. He recognized that Canadian contributions had been systematically undervalued and wanted to correct this. For the historical record, publishing this manuscript honors his commitment to historical accuracy and his respect for those who fought under his command. What Eisenhower had finally admitted in the last months of his life was that he had known throughout his command that Canadian forces were operating at an elite level and deserved recognition proportional to their contributions, that he had been constrained by politics from providing that recognition fully, and that he wanted history to ultimately reflect the truth, even though he had been unable to speak it completely during his active career. This admission, preserved in handwritten manuscript, deposited in an archive, and published 3.5 decades after his death, stands as the final professional testimony of one of the 20th century's most consequential military leaders about the capabilities and contributions of Canadian forces in the most important conflict of the modern era. The Canadians deserved better than they received. Eisenhower knew it while it was happening, and in the end, he made sure it was written down.